So, good day everybody, and welcome back to the Great Books of China series. Um, Last video I've talked quite a lot about the connection between poetry and religion, and it turned into quite theoretical sort of consideration about the role of poetry and its relation to lived experience and then the doctrines of religion. And in another episode, I talked also about something a little bit related to that, the importance of ritual and manners for ancient Chinese culture, the concept of li and how it relates to literature, and wen, which is the Chinese word for literature. And I sort of talked a little bit in that episode about how the ritual, these prescriptions and examples of behavior, was such a large and important part of the scriptural tradition, and also how morals and aesthetics were not considered entirely separate domains, and that the ritual in ancient Chinese culture existed as a kind of element partaking both of aesthetics and morals in the Western sense of these words. So you might say that the general theme that I'm sort of working myself towards in these videos is a little bit, I have discovered that in order to make sense of the Chinese tradition, you have to sort of deconstruct conventional the conventional compartmentalization of your mind that you walk around with largely unconsciously as a modern Westerner. And we tend to think about all of these things as separate domains, like the religious is something different from the literary is something different from the moral is something different from the aesthetic is something different from the ritual, and so on and so forth. And most of these categorizations, compartmentalizations, and dichotomies don't really make sense in a Chinese context. And I thought I'd just go on and talk a little bit about the idea about religion, because it's one of the things that I think causes serious misunderstandings of Chinese poetry, and also causes it to be largely ignored and so hugely underrated in the Western world. Chinese literature is not popular, Chinese poetry is not popular, and I don't think it's just because the language is so difficult and because it's so difficult to translate, though it's partly that. I think it's also that we fail to grasp the appropriate emotional significance that a lot of things have in the Chinese tradition, because we think of them as strictly secular things, but they have a sort of religious significance for the Chinese. They have the value of symbols, they have the value of poetic elements, making up a completely different world picture than the one we're used to. And it takes quite a lot of humbleness and intentional deconstruction of your own set of mind, your own frameworks of thinking and perceiving, you might say, in order to sort of emerge in that other spacious and light place where these things actually do make sense to you. And as I said, I'm going to make the idea of the secular and the religious my theme for today. And these are things that we instinctively know what they mean in the West. The secular and the sacred is something that's been a constant feature of Western society for more than 1,000 years. Close to, more than 2,000 years, I should say. We've had in Europe and in other places as well, but predominantly in Europe, very obvious clear and unambiguous two-part system of authority. You've had sacred authority on the one hand, and you've had secular authority on the other. You had the church, and then you had the state, and it's been very clear throughout history, more or less, that these two systems of power, systems of authority, have their separate domains. Now, it's not all that clear cut if you look at any single period of European history, and they vary quite a lot. But there has been this I'm using this word all the time, this division all the time in the European society as a purely sociological and social phenomenon. And during my thesis here, which is I'm not the one who came up with originally, of course, is that we have become habituated into looking at the world in terms of the secular and the sacred as a consequence of our societies being structured in this way. So we think it's reasonable to look at other cultures in this way as well. The most famous embodiment of this Western attitude is which actually tells you that this is a feature of Christian culture. It's the saying of Jesus Christ: "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." This is, of course, actually, in reality, it's a situation that's even older than Christianity, because what we have in the West is there is a long tradition of multicultural empires, which started in the Near East. I mean, a very good example preceding the Christian era by several hundred years is the Persian Empire. Very good example of a multicultural empire, which is not sort of actively trying to impose its religion on its subjects and the conquered peoples, but then automatically finds itself in the situation of having to sort of arbitrate between different priesthoods, different religious traditions, and establishing the idea of the secular state as something different from spiritual authority. But this thing didn't exist in China. It didn't exist at all in China. There hasn't really been this kind of multicultural empire in China ever. China has always grown from inside, you might say. It's like it's been growing, it's been expanding, it's been eating steadily away on the borders of neighboring peoples, but it usually hasn't gone out and made like large scale foreign incursions into other areas, and then establishing itself as a kind of arbitrator between these two systems. No, it's always been very China-centric, very China-centric, and also most of the conquests, that's the word, the conquests of the various Chinese dynasties have not been very long-lived. It's been an incremental process of the Chinese empire growing like this. But this is a very superficial historical analysis that I'm making here now, of course. But I think it does make sense to look at the cultures in this way anyway, because you can observe it very easily in the West that there is not just in terms of power, but also, for example, in the arts, that it's obvious that sacred music is something different from secular music. Sacred art and secular art follow different conventions. Sacred poetry is different from secular poetry. And even, as I say, this categorization might not always be clear-cut, but there's no doubt that this dichotomy at least can be seen as operational within the Western context. But it doesn't really make sense in Chinese. And one of the really good signs that it doesn't make sense in Chinese is that there is not even a word for religion. We don't have terms for these things in ancient Chinese. The modern Chinese word for religion, zongjiao, is not older than the 19th century, and it was introduced into the Chinese language, the coinage, that is, not the characters in themselves. This combination of two characters might always also have occurred before the 19th century, but it was a term that was introduced specifically in order to translate the Western word religion, zongjiao. And as I said, in China, the social reality of the ancient Chinese world was that there was no separate priesthood. There was no, not like in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome even, where there used to be cults to certain gods in certain places, and then they would have a society of priests and holy persons attached to them, which was hereditary. And then this tradition evolved and became the separate church priesthood. That didn't exist in China, not on that scale. There existed, of course, pockets of very spiritual people, like the monasteries, the Buddhist monasteries, but that was a much more marginal phenomenon in China. In China, there has not been a formal separation between holy persons and the lay people. But on the other hand, what's happened instead was that the institution of the emperor and monarchy in general was imbued with this immense spiritual significance, because the emperor was, among other things, the most important spiritual office in ancient China. And actually the word for emperor, Huangdi, Di, this character Di, that was traditionally not the name for the emperor or for the temporal ruler. Di was an ancient sky god. He was let's call him he. He was the central deity of the Shang dynasty religion. So I'm talking about the monarchy ruling China up until 1000 BC or so now. And their religion, the Shang dynasty religion, their religion seems to have been a monotheism or something closely resembling a monotheism. That's the sort of consensus of scholars today. And some have even speculated that this word Di is related to the Indo-European god words Deus, Deva, and so on. And I don't know if there's anything to that, linguistically speaking, but it's a theory that's been advanced by some people at least. And it would be really exciting if that was the case. And this word Di, it was only much later that this word was appropriated by emperors to refer to themselves. But on the other hand, it says something about what the office of the emperor always implied. Because even before this happened, before this name Di stopped being the god and became the emperor, the highest rulers and the heads of dynasties, they used to refer to themselves as Wang. And it's the character Wang, king. It's the oldest word signifying a ruler, usually translated as king. You know this character if you know any Chinese at all. And the classical explanation for the shape of the character Wang, with the 3 bars united by one vertical line, is that this vertical line is the king. And the king connects the 3 domains of being, you might say. The domains of the heaven, earth, and the human world. And these 3 are sometimes referred to as the san cai, the 3 potentialities. And the king, who later became the emperor, he was seen as having great influence on not just human affairs, but also the affairs of the natural world. So therefore it was his responsibility to communicate with the elements, the various gods, for example, in order to make the climate suitable for agriculture, avoiding droughts, having it rain on time, and so on. And it was to this end that every year the emperor presided over these enormous ceremonies that you might have read about and that you might be familiar with. This function persisted long into Chinese history. If you go to Beijing, for example, you find there the Temple of Heaven, the Tiantan, which is perhaps the most iconic site in all of China. I'll put up a picture here for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about. This is this gigantic temple complex that's devoted entirely to the function of the emperor communicating with heaven. And this is built in the Ming dynasty. And it was used up until the fall of the empire in the 20th century. And if you look at the entire layout of Beijing, it actually, you can say that it actually constitutes a kind of sacred geography. We have the imperial palace in the center, that's the forbidden city that you're all familiar with, I suppose. And then to the south, you have this great temple complex, the Tiantan, the Temple of Heaven, devoted to heaven. And equidistantly from the central palace, you also have large temple grounds that are devoted to Earth in the north, and then the sun in the east, and the moon in the west. And all of these are public parks today. And of course, this is well-known information. I know that. I know that I'm talking about things that everyone who knows a little bit about China is familiar with. Everyone knows that the emperor was, among other things, an immensely important spiritual office. But I think the problem is that it's usually understood in our Western traditional terms, that in our way of thinking, it means that the emperor is still the head of a secular state, but he also has some religious functions. But my suspicion or my intuition is that these institutions of the Chinese culture are, you can say that they're religious through and through in a way, if you want to apply that frame of thinking on the Chinese culture. Then you can just as well say that they're completely religious as saying that they're completely secular. Of course, the true the true way of putting this is actually that the dichotomy is non-operational. But I'm still trying to make the point that we can try to see Chinese culture in general as much more religious than we tend to do, in order to get closer to the reality of that time compared with the reality of our preconceptions. And I think especially when reading poetry, this is important. And I've been reading Du Fu obsessively for the last few months, and I think you lose quite a lot if you don't remember this in your reading, because there are a lot of poems that just kind of pass you by until you realize the sort of religious overtones that they have. A lot of the time, there are a lot of, not just in Du Fu, a lot of poetry in the Chinese tradition deals explicitly or implicitly with the office of the emperor and the institution of the monarchy. And it seems to have such an immense emotional complex attached to it. And it is absurd to us almost. It's as absurd as if you would be in love with the social democratic state of Sweden. I mean, not even people who agree with that kind of government, which I certainly don't, but that's a parenthesis. Not even people who agree with that can have this intense sort of religious feelings about it. It's simply not appropriate in our culture to have that kind of relationship, or have that kind of mythical worldview on our secular authorities, because we perceive them as dealing exclusively with the here and now and not with eternity. But in the Chinese context, the ancient Chinese context, the way I think to read Chinese poetry properly is to realize that there are religious overtones to everything, and that makes them more interesting and more aesthetically powerful as well. And it's actually kind of humbling to realize that when reading this, it's if you don't get something, it's you that's the problem, it's not the poems. So I'll just go ahead and I'll give you an example of a poem that doesn't really hit you with all its force until you realize that this oneness that the sacred and the secular had for the Chinese, and especially the intimate connection between welfare of the state and welfare of the natural world. So this is another poem by Du Fu, and this was written at the height of the Anlushan rebellion. So the empire is just being torn to pieces. People are being slaughtered by the millions, and every man is dragged from his home in order to serve in the army and try to put out the various military crises that are erupting all over the empire. And on top of it, this year when this was written, I think this is probably in 757 or 758, there was also a drought in summer, and this is called the summer, a lament, a summer day lament, 夏日叹. And in this translation, I'm sort of dispensing with all the poetic flourishes in the translation because I wasn't feeling poetically inclined when I translated this. So this is going to be a more prosaic translation. Okay, the poem goes like this. The summer sun emerges in the northeast and climbs the ecliptic of heaven. Its crimson rays strike the earth's thickness. When shall this scorching stop? The azure vaults rise, long without thunder, as if some command somewhere went wrong. No falling rain moists the nether things, and good fields are turned to yellow dust. The winged birds die from the terrible heat. In the lakes, fish lie gasping in the mud, while humanity's children flee over the earth, and all is withered rushes as far as the eye sees. And still, all lands north of the river is turned a place of tigers and jackals. Through these upheavals, I think of those lands. Where are the royal troops to be seen? Such disharmony grabs my heart that I am unable to swallow my meal. O distant friends, to be one of your number who lived when this kingdom was young. And I will not make too many comments on this poem. I'll try to leave that meditation to you yourself, but one thing that I think is central is to realize that according to my long introduction to this poem, is I think the proper way of reading this is that it's not that these things that he's talking about in the poem, it's not that they are symbols for the political crisis exactly. That's not exactly the right way to think about it. They are the political crisis. It's not that Du Fu sees the heat and the drought on the one hand, and then he sort of thinks of the war and the lot of the people on the other, and then he has the brilliant idea to put them together. No, it's a kind of seeing of these things as one and the same situation. Because to the Chinese mind, at that time, the empire had cosmic significance. It was the house of being, not just for humankind, but for all of the cosmos. All of the natural world also fell within the rulership of the empire. And when something goes wrong in the empire, it means that things go wrong in the natural world as well. So having a drought and having fish lying gasping in the mud and birds dying from the heat, that is also in a way a sign of the times. It's not just, okay, we are having this terrible war and people are dying by the millions, and also why just by coincidence there happens to be a terrible drought as well. No, I don't think that's exactly how the Chinese looked upon it. And of course, I mean, a text like this, or any text from a wildly different culture with wildly different background assumptions, they're not going to tell you their background assumptions explicitly. You have to sort of infer that from the emotional tenor and the emotional content that these writings are invested with, even when there are things that look rather prosaic on the page. When you realize that people have been worshipping these writings for over 1,000 years, it tells you that there's something more going on there. And also, I don't think that this kind of Chinese religion or the Chinese spirituality, I don't think it's inferior to the Western one either. I think it's a kind of useful thing to look at ourselves in the mirror sometimes. We realize that to us we have separated these things so far, especially now. People don't even understand what the religious means anymore. We have mystified spirituality to such a degree that we think that the Chinese maybe they are lacking in this regard. They don't even have a proper religion. But I think this is all just a symptom of the fact that our thinking, probably even back since the Greeks, has tended to be very, here is the word again, compartmentalized. And only by trying to deconstruct that in a Heideggerian spirit. That means deconstructing in order to build up something again, not just merely blindly deconstructing, critiquing in order to build something up in a monumental way. Then you have a very good basis for understanding any other culture. If you know yourself and your own culture very well, then you're in a position to read others, or at least you can make the try. All right, I will make the video a little bit shorter today than usually. Thank you for listening. See you next time.